All right, next thing we're going to go into we're going to talk about some other improvement things. The next one is going to be Kaizen. Kaizen is for change. Sometimes you'll see the word blitz added to that, so it means it's a rapid change. Sometimes you'll see a Kaizen event, which is a very focused effort at making an improvement. Now we'll go into some other lean topics in a little bit more detail. There's an entire glossary of terms in your note packets. Let's talk about cycle time reduction. Why is it important to have cycle times reduced? Cost is one, but why is it a cost reduction? All right, so there's a cost of if there's less time invested in making the physical part, but the other reason that can be helpful is if you reduce your cycle time, you can potentially reduce the amount of inventory you have to have on hand. So you may actually change the average, but also the variation. So if you have a cycle time that's very consistent, you can predict when the raw materials need to show up in your factory, and you need less safety stock on hand to respond to that. All right, the next one is value stream mapping, VSM. Have any of you performed a value stream map at work? A couple of you may have, maybe not. All right, all right, thank you, Marcy, for getting an affirmative on that. Have any of the industry people performed a value stream map? Not yet. All right, basically, a value stream mapping is based on a couple key words. The first one is you have a current state. And we'll contrast that with a future state. And I'm not going to go into all of the figures that go with that, but what I want you to recognize is a value stream is it's basically a flow chart, if you will, of the manufacturing process and the inventory storage points, and you're trying to reduce both the cycle time, but usually you're looking at the value, excuse me, let me just draw a little picture to go along with this. If you have a pie chart showing the time in system, it's common that the value add, the time that is valuable to the customer tends to be very small, and the wait time, delay time, accumulation time, waiting for the next step, etc., is a big portion of the time that a product flows through a manufacturing step. So if you're able to take your current state, in other words, the delays and how long a part is waiting, and change this graphic, it actually can make a smaller piece of pie. So if this was originally 10 days to go through a system and get it down to 1 day, then that chart would look something more like this, that the big piece of the pie is now valuable to our customer. Does that conceptually make sense to everybody? And that's where the term value stream comes from. You have all the process steps, and you're trying to increase the percentage of the value time, and by doing that, maybe your entire time that that product goes through the system is now 1 day or 5 days instead of 10. So some people are very obsessed with the images, the figures for that. I myself am not as much of a Nazi as that goes, but it's still a good process to break those out like that. So future state is you draw a picture which is different than the current state, showing you your improvements that you've made. So value stream mapping is a compact way to communicate that change in the value stream of that. The next lean topic I will talk about is 5S. So these were originated with Japanese words which happen to start with the letter S, and I am happy that somebody has sat down and translated and found other English words that start with the letter S so that we can, at least for my sake, understand these a lot more, and I'm not going to even attempt to pronounce the other ones. Basically what this is there are 5 steps or sequential ways to improve a workspace area, and the first one is sort. In other words, that go through the items you don't need or needed. Next one is to straighten. Classic things you see on that are shadow boards. Or cutouts that show you where those items should be, or labeling. One of my stories I frequently tell related to 5S is that it's critical to recognize what is valuable to people doing the task. So this scenario goes like this. I made a coat rack for my kids, and I was very proud of it because I routed the edge of it, stained it. First day from school when it was hung up, they all run in. They jump because it's too high. Coats don't hook. They run into the living room. And I'm left with a pile of coats, and nothing actually happens. So the moral of this story is, I thought I had a great suggestion as the manager of the family that this is the correct place to put your coat. But if you can't reach it, it's not going to be useful. So I tell that story because it's common in manufacturing environments that somebody else gets assigned the 5S project. That person is designated to walk into someone else's work cell and tell them how to straighten their workspace. And then later it's like, oh, it's not working out. Well, it's because it's not natural to do that. So I learned a lesson the hard way. I have a nice coat rack just for my coats now, and coats all over the floor still. All right, so the other one is to shine, and that is to make sure that you have a like a scheme for this. So the idea with this from a manufacturing standpoint is if you have equipment that is operating, when it is clean, you'll know when was the last time it leaked. Well, we clean it every day, so if there's an oil leak, that means that that leak has occurred since the last shift. Standardize. Now, the reason this is important as well is that, or beneficial, is if you're sharing the workspace with another person, if you standardize where everything goes, then it's agreed upon where those items go. Now, granted, I still struggle with this at home. I have what I call the archival storage method, that I know that how deep in the stack something is, that's where I go to look for it. And so if someone is being helpful in consolidating stacks, I don't know where in the geological formation of that stack I need to look for those things. So making sure everyone knows the standardization is very important for that to be useful. And then the last one is sustain. How do you make this? It's fairly easy for people to get through 3 of the S's, maybe come up with a plan for the standardized, but sustaining it is very difficult. And once again, our goal with the 5S ideas are when you're sharing workspaces, how to look at that. All right, so another thing to recognize is we can use thing to say non-value add. So at Daktronics we use a phrase called Tim Wood. Any of you know that? It's all right, the initials. And I didn't actually look at this ahead of time, so we might have to do a little bit of guessing on what those are. Anybody want to help fill in some of these words here? These are things that are done that are non-value added. In other words, your customer is not going to pay you any more money if you have more of this. So one of these is inventory. Or maybe that's, you might use the word excess. Because you do have to have a certain amount of inventory to flow through your flow lines and not starve important machines. Anybody else want to speculate on some? You have them in your notes there, that could help.
Transport?
Yep, transportation. I worked at a company that had, draw a quick picture here, this is not necessarily to scale, but it's a fun story nonetheless. All right, so this is a very small image of a very large building. At this particular company, they originally had a door on the north side of the building, but because of over time they stopped using it, and people didn't like the north wind blowing through, so the door still existed, but they just piled stuff in front of it. So there's this work center here, and there's a forklift that had to drive all the way around outside and put stuff on a pallet or a set of shelves that was directly outside the door that no one used anymore. And it was far enough that it was multiple miles per week that were driven by a forklift to put the stuff away, go get it. And I considered it a success that I was able to negotiate during the spring. We would use that door to cut down the travel time. I mean, literally, the shelf was right outside the door, and we would drive all the way through the building to put those things away. So that's definitely one of those. Any other ones that anybody else? Say again? Motion. Now, motion and transportation can be kind of maybe looked at similarly, but I think most frequently motion is within the workstation for the actual employee doing the work. We can wait. In other words, the longer that a part waits for the next process. I was working at one company where they paid overtime to help us, not help us, but each end of year we did a full physical inventory of everything. I worked there 3 years, and I found it very interesting that on these shelves there were the parts that we had to handwrite the inventory ticket. And so after the 3rd year, when I was reaching up there and grabbing, and I could see the dust ring and the look, and I was like, well, those are my 2 inventory cards from 2 years ago. Maybe we don't need those parts anymore if we're paying someone to come in and count those. The reason I kept them, just so you understand how this game's played, is it had inventory value, and if we threw it away, then our financial books would take a loss. So that's why they kept a lot of parts for people to count the stuff. And it was, the reason it was on the shelf so long is it was a custom-made part for something that was obsolete. So it was never going to be used again. But it lived on forever. We also have over-processing. I've even talked to one of the suppliers I work with, and he was mentioning that he has a client that is very flexible, much more flexible than Daktronics, but yet they continue to make parts to the same standard we expect. And he was mentioning that maybe he could loosen up that because he's over-processing so that the same product is good for all customers, but that's not necessarily true. Does that make sense? We're talking kind of like polishing, or let's say that pizza delivery, maybe not pizza delivery, but grocery delivery. If you could get that within 4 hours, that might be perfectly fine. You know, so if you can get it in 10 minutes, is there any benefit for that? It's over-processing. Overproduction is what this means. It's kind of related to that inventory, that you make more than you need at that time. I believe D is probably defects. All right, I want to talk a little bit about takt time. So takt, I believe, is that German for pace? Any German-speaking people here? Yes, no? I believe that's what that is. So I'm going to jump to another topic and then come back to takt time. So this is off of the Theory of Constraints. Have any of you read the book called The Goal? It's Joe's humored by something I've done. All right. You're not. I've actually read it. Nonetheless, the reason this book is relevant to this class at this time is that the author of this book, Eli Goldright, actually wrote a kind of like a novel, and it was it's based on a factory environment. So most novels you read about are, like somebody in a crime scene investigation or something of that nature. But this person actually wrote a novel talking about the topics of theory of constraints, which are based on three things of throughput, what's the other terms here? Inventory and operation. Expenses. And if you do have, I do recommend the book. It's fairly easy to read, and it helps you understand concepts such as bottlenecks. And so, very briefly, I'm leaving out a lot of key parts of the story, but nonetheless, there's a plant manager. He's suffering because his plant is not producing enough parts, even though his employees are very busy. His son wants him to go on a Boy Scout trip, and so he's out on this hike with all these Boy Scout kids, and one of the characters in the book is called Herbie, and Herbie is this very slow walking kid, and so the whole group has to wait for this kid named Herbie to make it through the woods on their hike. And the main character has this epiphany that if I place the slowest walking person first, everybody else can keep up on their hike. And so the connection to his manufacturing plant is that he recognizes that Herbie, the slow, chubby kid trying to carry all these extra stuff on the hike, is actually the bottleneck of his manufacturing facility. So the tie to this is that the throughput of your facility is based on the slowest machine of your factory. So the challenge, if any of you have been a scheduler in a large plant, is how do you decide what work gets done at what pieces of equipment, and then trying to keep that all figured out. So theory of constraints mindset is you purposefully set a bottleneck, you know which one it is, and you schedule that one, and everything else will take care of it on its own. Another analogy for this is if you're going on a long, what do we call that, road trip with other vehicles. Maybe you've never done this, but back in the day, my example will be military convoys. So all the vehicles are governed, but occasionally there's a couple fast ones, or people that take other risks, whatever the case may be. So if you put the slowest vehicle first, everyone else will be able to catch up over time. But if you put the slower vehicle to the middle or back, it will never catch up. It just won't. So what I want you to get from this is that there's the book called The Goal, and basically if you, the whole book is off that page 28. Let me just jot these up here real quick because they are conceptually worthwhile. First thing is find out the constraint, which is the slowest object or machining step. Keep in mind that you can actually force a constraint by intentionally slowing it down. And there's, it's beyond the scope of this class, but it is proven that if you actually slow down but have it very consistent, you will actually get more throughput through it. It's counterintuitive, but it does work. Then you try to exploit that constraint. So the example for this is, let's say a company knows that, oh, machine A is our bottleneck, and that's the fastest we can get anything through. But it's fascinating to me how many companies you go to that place and they tell you that's the constraint. The horn goes off for break, the machine shuts off, everybody goes to break. What's the problem with that? Well, that's the constraint. If you shut that off, your whole plant is shut down. So if you really want to make an improvement, all you got to do is make sure that your constraint runs through break, and you automatically get 15 minutes per break more production just by doing that. The other machines, doesn't matter, they're fast enough, they'll catch up over time. Third thing is to subordinate to that constraint, meaning that organize your factory so that everything's connected to that. And oops, not spelling that right now. All right, so now we're going to come back to the word tact. That is the pace of your constraint. And sometimes you'll hear the phrase drum, buffer, and rope. So the concept of drum, buffer, rope is that if you have everybody linked together with a rope, and then you have a drum beat, which is the pace that your factory is operating, and your buffer is that slack of that rope. So you can come up closer to somebody, then you stop until the person in front of you proceeds, and the rope means that no one can go any faster than what that whole system can perform at. So that is theory of constraints, and that is related to the takt time or pace of a facility. Page 23 is next. Next thing that's helpful in a lean facility is what's called a visual factory. my word for this is to seed. In other words, it is easier to detect when there's a problem if the visual cues indicate that there's a problem. Does that make sense? So that's why we use andon lights. I think this is the correct spelling, andon. In other words, you'll see that frequently on CNC pieces of equipment. There'll be like a red light, a yellow, and a green. Green means it's functioning as expected. I'm not sure what yellow means, but it's a visual cue. So if you're looking out over the factory and if you have lights, you can see. You don't have to have any communication, radios or anything like that. You can just see that very quickly. So you want things that you can see that are visible or visual. That's redundant, isn't it? Yeah, that's pretty straightforward on that one. Another term you may hear that we borrow from the Japanese is kanban. That might mean the word card. Or sometimes you might see the sign. So a kanban signal is nothing more than authorization to proceed. So we at Daktronics use this. Going back to the example of the group in a road trip, everybody's traveling down the road, you get a card or signal that you may proceed to the next town, so you're keeping together, and you can't proceed until you have that card or signal to proceed. So the way it would work in a manufacturing environment is if I have some workstations here, I have some type of card or signal that says I may begin production, and that card allows you to produce 10 units, and then you don't produce any more until the workstation that you're supplying has more capacity to do that. Does that kind of make sense? One quick way to do that is you can make little buckets, if you will, and you can fill that bucket as long as you have an empty bucket at your workstation. If you don't, you stop and wait until material handling has given you an empty bucket to go to. So the way that could work very simply is if you have 10 buckets and each bucket holds 10, that means there'll be no more than 100 units in work in your plant at one time. If you want to reduce the level of inventory, you just simply take a bucket out of circulation and your inventory work in progress will drop by 10. So it's remarkably simple when you do things such as that for Kanban. Next phrase we talk about in Lean frequently is standard work. There's not a lot different, in my opinion, between this and procedures, but standard work is the routine, the best way to perform that task, and that is frequently used at Daktronics. Some of the key things that will be in a documentation, it'll be cycle time of how much time is allocated for that, the work sequence, as well as standard inventory, the practice for that. Now we have SMED, our friend, who's also known as single minute exchange of die. Which is a remarkably long phrase to just say, hey, we're going to try to get our setups down to 1 minute or less. Where this came about is we talked about Toyota at the beginning of our semester was challenged because they basically just got almost bombed off of the face of the earth, so they had very few resources. So if you were going to build an entire Toyota vehicle, you couldn't make 50,000 right fenders and then 50,000 left fenders and then another 50,000 right rear, left rear, etc. So what they had to do is change their stamping tooling so that they could do those other parts very quickly. All right, so that's the reason it's called single minute exchange of die. And a die in a metal forming process typically may even take hours even today. All right, so if someone challenges you and says, hey, setups are a big deal, there's no way we can get under an hour, just ask them, well, do you ever watch automobile racing? How long is a stop on pit row? Do we have any NASCAR type fans?
3-4 seconds or something, isn't it?
12 and a half, 13 seconds.
I think it's closer to
30 seconds.
13's pretty good. If you're taking over a minute, you've pretty much lost the race. I don't know if that's fair, but all right. So we're talking 13 seconds. Now think of yourself going out to the shop floor and telling someone to change over to another job in 1 minute. Even today, how many people would just completely have a? Some of them wouldn't even listen to you, I'm guessing. But the point is, in automobile racing, it is so critical that you're okay with it, because if you don't do it, you lose. And so I'm waiting for the day when industry finally figures out that we can measure things in seconds as far as changeover compared to hours. So with single minute exchange of die, what are some of the things you can do? I think this is a little bit extra than what's said in this. So there's internal and external setup. And sometimes I get these backwards. If I'll get this correct. The external are things that you can do outside of the process. So using the automobile pit row example, when the vehicle comes into pit row, do they already know what adjustments might be necessary? Yes, they probably know ahead of time how much fuel is required. Are we going to make any actual adjustments to the anything to the vehicle? Are we going to change tires, yes or no? Which tires are we going to change, etc. That is all known before that vehicle comes off of the... so the same thing is true when you have a machine set up. If you know ahead of time that you're going to change your computer program, maybe you should check to see whether you have that program. So at one company I was at, we'd have a CNC machine, we'd have to do a change over, and the operator would go, oh, I guess I don't have a program for this, I should walk into the main office to get a program written for this. All the while the machine is just sitting there waiting to be changed over. So what you do is you take all of the steps that you possibly can to make them external to the machine being stopped or the process being stopped. Then what you try to do is everything that is internal to that, you do as absolutely insanely fast as you can, which is the example of the NASCAR, that when that vehicle comes in, what do? They send more than one person out there to do that. So think in industry, how many setup teams are there? There's almost, the mindset is, oh, we have a setup person, one, and that person, depending on how your organization thinks, might be one of the lowest persons on the totem pole, maybe not. But nonetheless, there's frequently just one person rather than a team. And so my point is, if it's good enough for NASCAR, would it be good enough to have 6 or 7 people attack that machine, get it back up to running, especially when, let's say that piece of equipment is our bottleneck. So if it's not a bottleneck, then hey, fine, it's okay to take longer for it. But if it is a bottleneck, let's go ahead and put 2 people on that. And it doesn't have to be skilled people necessarily in our work environment. We can just have an extra person that's available to go get assistance for that skilled setup person so that they're not delayed anymore. There's invariably things that happen, like during a switch out for a bottleneck machine, maybe actually have a maintenance person directly there at the time that changeover is being done, so you can get an immediate response for that. So that is single minute exchange of die. We talked about theory of constraints already. I think that is my goal for today. We'll start on page 29 on next week. All right, so little programming notes. Next week will be me, and I think the next week, you guys know if Jeff is still on tap for...
Yeah, he plans on it.
All right, so take that message home that we're giving Jeff credit for. Is Brian going to be coming along too, maybe, or?
I hope so. But
Okay.
He's always, you never know, he gets so busy. Or maybe he just makes himself busy.
All right, so please try to come on Halloween night for the example of doing auditing. So Jeff McKay has many hours of experience, not just hours, probably days of experience with that. All right, so have a great evening, and we'll see you guys next week.